Welcome to our video, and today what we're going to look at is one of the most historically important sites in Belfast, and that of course is Clifton Street Cemetery. Now you're probably wondering, where's the cemetery, what are you doing standing here? But the fact of the matter is, this is the old poor house. It's today's Clifton House, but in fact it's the old poor house. Not to be confused with the workhouse. The workhouse was a completely different institution. The poor house, it was established, as you can see by the weather vane, in 1774 to help the poor of Belfast, but in particularly the elderly. Now, the whole thing was self-sufficient. It was granted lands by Lord Donegall, and it had its own farms and it grew its own crops. And whenever someone died in the poor house, they were buried in the old burying ground, which was at the bottom of High Street. Now, what had happened in the 1780s was the old burying ground had closed, and that left the poor house with nowhere to bury the poor. So what had happened for a short time was they had copied the townsfolk of Belfast and got buried at Knockbracken, which then was a village outside of Belfast. But what they decided to do is they had allocated a fantastic sounding name of field number 6 at the back of the poor house, and they built a wall around it. Now the idea of that was it gave them somewhere to bury the poor who died in the poor house. But it had another bonus which they had not planned. And what had happened was Belfast townsfolk had come along and wanted to buy graves in the graveyard, in the poor's graveyard. And that's exactly what had happened. And so what was created was this field that was to bury the poor became the graveyard. And what it was called at the time was, to distinguish it from the old burying ground, it was called the new burying ground. And, the word new is no longer appropriate for something that's 300 years old. So what it gets today is Clifton Street Cemetery. And what we're going to do now, folks, is we're going to take a walk up and we're going to have a look around some of the fascinating history that can be found within that cemetery. So when the Belfast Poor House, whenever they opened up the graveyard and set the land aside for the graveyard, the whole idea was basically what is this ground here, and it was for somewhere to bury the poor who died within the poor house. This is where the hidden history comes into it, because a lot of people who would visit the graveyard would just look at this ground and just think nothing much of it. There's only a few people buried under a few headstones on it. But the fact of the matter is, this ground has over 7,000 people buried in it. And a lot of them were buried during the period of the Great Famine, and it's a real tragic sight. But what happened with the poor house is, once they opened the graveyard and it gave them somewhere to bury the poor, there was also other people who came along and asked, could they buy graves within the poor house graveyard? And that's exactly what they done, and that is exactly why we have the rich lying alongside the poor, sometimes only as inches apart. So as I mentioned, the large poor ground, it has 7,000 people buried in it, but overall in the graveyard in total, there's over 14,500 people buried. And as I says, the rich lie alongside the poor. So while we have the poor in the poor ground, we have vaults like this. And just to give an example, this one here, this is the Donegall family. And they lived in Redburn Estate, just outside Bangor, and they were massive whiskey distillers. And what's interesting about it is Donegall's closed for many years, but they're now back to making Donegall whiskey. The one next to it is the Heron family, and these are names that don't mean much to many people, but they were one of the first bankers in Belfast, and they opened up a bank called Belfast Savings Bank, and that continued right into existence right until 1961. And what happened with the bank was merged with a number of banks throughout Britain and Ireland, and it became the TSB, which is Trustees Savings Bank. And of course TSB in Ireland changed to First Trust Bank. So what we have here is the founders of what is now the First Trust Bank, And then in the upper section of the graveyard, we have a large vault, which is the Luke family, and they are the founders of the Ulster Bank. Now, just staying where I am, this grave here, this is one of two brothers, the Ritchie brothers, and they were two Scottish brothers who came to Belfast, and they brought something that Belfast is internationally famous for, and that is shipbuilding. They were the very first shipbuilders ever in Belfast, but their yard was in the northern part of Belfast, so roughly where the large harbour office is today is where their shipyard is, and a lot of it still exists behind the harbour office. But staying with shipbuilding, we also have the Andrews family. Now, the Andrews family were big mill owners, but their grandson is connected with one of the most famous ships ever to exist, and that, of course, is the Belfast-built Titanic, because Thomas Andrews, the grandson, was the person who designed the Titanic, and tragically, he also went down with it. Now, this is a grave here of William Drennan, and as you can see on the headstone, William Drennan MD, so he was a doctor. And it's a name that a lot of people would never ever have heard of. But believe it or not, this man is one of the most significant men in the whole of Irish history. And the reason for that is because in the 1760s, early 1770s, William Drennan and a couple of others, Henry Joy McCracken, Wolfe Tone, Samuel Nielsen, they had got together and they went and they bought a copy of the newsletter. And the reason they got the copy of this newsletter was because on the front page was printed the American Declaration of Independence. And what they'd done is they left Crown Entry, from where the newsletter office was, they crossed the road and into Sugar House Entry, and they sat in a pub. And in that pub, they read this Declaration of Independence and thought, do you know something? We could do that. So in effect, what they'd done was by getting this newspaper and sitting having a few drinks, they had founded Irish republicanism. Now, a lot of people have that credited down to Wolfe Tone. It was not Wolfe Tone, because the first organisation set up was the Belfast Society of United Irishmen. And that's very important, the Belfast Society, and that was in 1792. And William Drennan was the man who basically came up with the idea. Now, the only thing William Drennan was against was a rebellion, which the United Irishmen had later fought in 1798, and of course they lost. And Drennan was against the rebellion. He wanted to use education to show people that there was a better way. You know, it's just tragic that this man's name is totally forgotten. Now, for those who don't know who the United Irishmen were, the United Irishmen, they're saying the very first organisation was the Belfast Society of United Irishmen. Whenever they became a prescribed organisation, they became known as the Young Irelanders. Later on, the Young Irelanders became known as the Irish Republican Brotherhood, who were better known as the Fenians. And in 1919, somebody had figured out in Wynn's Hotel in Dublin, do you know something? Brotherhood sounds too friendly. Let's change it to Army. And what they became was the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. So these are the people, as I said, who founded Irish republicanism. Now, you'll also see on the headstone there's a poem. And the poem states, the Emerald Isle may grant a wider claim and link the patriot with his country's name. And what Drennan's doing with that poem is he's being bitchy. Because what he's really saying was, Wolfe Tone had nothing to do with the founding of the United Irishmen. It was me. That's what he's saying. But the interesting thing about the poem is if you go to any part of the world, Ireland is known as the Emerald Isle. That is the first time ever it was called the Emerald Isle on that poem, on that headstone. So staying with the United Irishmen, and this grave here is without doubt one of the most famous people who are, well, two of the most famous people who are buried in this graveyard. The front headstone is Henry Joy McCracken, and the second headstone is his sister, Mary Ann McCracken. As I said, Henry Joy McCracken was one of the founders of the United Irishmen, and he was with William Drennan whenever the whole idea came about. To cut a very long story short, Henry Joy McCracken took part in the Battle of Antrim. They lost, and he fled to Cave Hill. And while he was fleeing Cave Hill, his sister had arranged a passage with the father to get him to America. And while he was coming down off Cave Hill, he was captured and, of course, sent for trial. Now, whenever he was sent for trial, he was charged with treason. And it's important to mention that because he was charged with treason, it was a military case. It was not a criminal case. And he was held in artillery barracks. And whenever he was taken out for trial, which was in the old exchange rooms, he was taken down, and all sorts were attempts were made to not to execute him, because the man in charge of the trial was also a personal friend of his father. So he was in a really awkward position. But Henry John McCracken was having none of it. And he turned around and says to try him the same as everybody else. And they even offered him a way out by informing on the people who had organised the rebellion and organised the whole revolution. And he said no, he refused. But the people that he was asked to inform on were all dead, because they were all executed the week before. So he really is a remarkable man, a very, very brave man, and that is why he is so notable today. Now, his sister, even though she was a woman, she was also a member of the United Irishmen. And she went on to have a remarkable life, because after Henry Joy's execution, she dedicated the rest of her life to helping the poor, especially women and children. And some of the stuff that she done was just remarkable. To give you an example, she got abolished the practice of climbing boys. Climbing boys were young children who were sent up chimneys to clean them with a brush. And in Ireland at that time, there was over 200 children a year dying. So if that was 200 children dying, how many were crippled, how many were blinded? It's just countless. And she got that practice abolished. She also, along with another former United Irishman, Thomas Cabe, stopped slavery coming to Ireland. And what they done was, Mary Ann, right up until the end of her life, was giving out anti-slavery pamphlets in Belfast docks. And they got a petition saying, they got a declaration saying that slavery would never, ever come to Ireland. And the way she done it was, she organised a whole boycott with a religious organisation called the Society of Friends. They encouraged people not to buy tea or sugar, and that's exactly what everyone done. But it's interesting to note that what she had done, she had organised a boycott 70 years before Captain Boycott was even heard of. So to say she was a remarkable woman and advanced for her times is just, it doesn't cut it. But another thing that she done also was, she believed in the education of women, and that women were not property. So in other words, she was a suffragette 100 years before the suffragettes were even heard of. So returning back to our more tragic aspects of the history of the cemetery, this ground here is, as I was saying, visitors would come in, they would just see there's nothing on it and think nothing much about it. But the fact of the matter is that this ground here, there's over 3,000 people buried in it, and they were all buried in a 7-month period. And what this is to do with, it goes right back to 1832, the cholera epidemic which struck Ireland at that time, and it wiped out tens of thousands of people, including in Belfast. Now, the thing that you have to remember about Belfast at that time in 1832, Belfast was only a wee small town. It wasn't a big city that it is today. It was only a small town. So if that was the modern equivalent, we're talking about at least 250,000 people being killed. And this is the tragic aspect. And the way they done this here is they done it with, they dug 2 holes, 2 pits, and basically spent all day filling them, because that many people were dying. And the way they were collecting people was that at that time they believed that cholera was an airborne disease. So as soon as someone caught cholera, they were thrown out of the house, basically to die. And if you're familiar with the old Dickens type illustrations, people with carts, bring out your dead. That's exactly the way it was done. People just went around and collecting their dead bodies and bringing them up here to Clifton Street for burial in the large pits. And once one pit was full, it was topped off, filled in, and then the next pit was dug. There are descriptions at the time of the pits being 50 foot deep. So it just gives you an idea of how horrible that must have been. And the real tragedy about it is that people don't know about this. That people, they look back the good old days, oh, it must have been fantastic. There was absolutely nothing fantastic about them. So whenever people come into old pre-Victorian graveyards, a lot of them will see headstones like this, and they just think that, it's done for decorative purposes. It's done for, to raise the headstone off the ground. But far from it. And what these were for, they were designed to stop body snatchers. One of the first things they done was that whenever the body snatching craze came along, they got the large slabs like this and put it down on the grave. But all the grave robbers done was dug down the side of it. So what they done was they started to raise them up and put them on these pillars. And the idea was that if they dug down sidewards, the stone would come down on top of them. So these were designed to prevent body snatchers. Now, there's quite a number of different things. For example, the large vaults, that's why they were built, to stop them being stolen. And some graves, they would have had cages over them. And a lot of people think that when that occurred, it never happened here. Why would it not? You have a graveyard, you have dead bodies in it, the dead bodies are worth money. Now, the people who bought the bodies were surgeons. And the reason that the surgeons bought the bodies was to teach surgery. So this was the 1820s, the 1830s, when surgery was a taboo subject. And at those days, people believed that anything that God made, that man could not touch. But then people started to come along and go, don't think so. And so they started to teach surgery, and the only way to do that was to get dead bodies. And of course, the dead bodies came from all graveyards. And we didn't have 3-day wakes in those days. Most people were buried the day they died. And the body snatchers just kept an eye on the graveyards for burials, for fresh burials. And then they would come back in that night, dug up part of the grave, pulled the body up, and took it away to be sold to surgeons. And there was a lot of money. And to give an example, there was an incident in the graveyard in January 1828 when grave robbers came into this graveyard and dug up a coffin of a child. And there was a £50 reward offered, which doesn't sound like a lot now. But you try and imagine in 1828 how much £50 was. It was a lot of money. And of course, this horrible practice continued for quite a few years. But what happened was that I'm not sure if it was the first, but it was certainly one of the first acts of Parliament that was passed through the House of Commons without going through the House of Lords. And what that was the right to leave your body to medical science. And that wiped out body snatching overnight. But the only thing that we ought to be thankful for, and it was Dr. Knox. Dr. Knox was the doctor who bought the bodies of Burke and Hare. And he had said at the time, he says, there was little choice in the matter. It was either a voluntation of graveyards so that the profession of medicine may prevail, or medicine fall to the level of quacks. And whenever you think about it, folks, he was right. So we're returning to the United Irishmen, and as I mentioned, William Drennan, Henry Joy McCracken, Mary Ann McCracken, they're just a few of the United Irishmen who are buried here. We also have William Sims, who's buried behind me, Thomas Hamilton, and Thomas McKay. There are quite a few of them. But William Steele Dixon is without doubt one of my favourite because his story is a real tragic one. And he was a Presbyterian minister of Portaferry. The way the United Irishmen wore is whatever they were getting up to, the British knew about it because of informers. But whatever the British were up to, the United Irishmen knew about it for the same reason. And on one time what was happening was before the rebellion, the original rebellion was meant to be 1796, which is the year this graveyard opened. But it was put back to 1798. And before that rebellion, the British were going to arrest all the leaders of the United Irishmen and intern them in Fort George in Scotland. And the United Irishmen had found out about this, and everybody was told, don't be staying at house and get away and lie low and things like this. Except for William Steele Dixon. Nobody bothered to go down to tell him. So he was arrested and interned. And not only was he interned for a crime that he didn't commit, he was interned for a crime that didn't happen. So he was arrested before the rebellion and interned. Now, they knew who they were going for. They knew he was one of the leaders. But here's an interesting thing about the United Irishmen, the founders of Irish republicanism. When we think of Irish republicanism today, we associate it with the Catholic community. These people were all Presbyterians. Every single one of them. Now, when a rebellion took part, Catholics did fight, but they had their own organisation. They had the Defenders. So you had the United Irishmen who were Presbyterians fighting alongside the Defenders who were all Roman Catholic. But these people who were the Republicans were all Presbyterians. But there's something else. And if you even look at the United Irishmen, they're referred to as a society, the Society of United Irishmen. They referred to each other as brothers. They were also known as Brotherhood. They were all Freemasons. All the leaders of the United Irishmen were all prominent Freemasons. And you don't have to take my word for that. If you go to the Belfast headquarters in the Masonic Order, they open up on European Heritage Days. They'll bring you in and show you all the portraits of all the United Irishmen. If you go to the County Antrim headquarters, which is in Rosemary Street, look above the front door, you'll see the massive Masonic symbol. And over to the right, you'll see a plaque dedicated to the memory of our brother, Henry John McCracken. So not only were the United Irishmen the founders of republicanism, Presbyterians, they were all leading Freemasons. So just to conclude, whenever anybody comes to Clifton Street Cemetery, or as I mentioned earlier, to give it its proper name, the new burying ground, one of the first things they'll notice is that it's in two parts and it's divided by this wall. And a lot of people think that that's to do with, part of it's Catholic, part of it's Protestant, part of it's rich, part of it's poor. That's all nonsense. That is the original graveyard. So whenever the graveyard opened in 1796, this was the graveyard from the wall upwards. But the bit that we're in now is what's known as the Victorian section. And this was added on in the 1830s. And it's just really an extension to the graveyard. And the reason that we have the wall is because this is an extension. But the wall part is where all the money was to be made, because the wall graves were the graves that sold for the most money. So basically what they done is they doubled their profits on the central wall, and that is why it was kept. I hope you enjoyed that short video of our tour of Clifton Street Cemetery, and I hope it gave you a bit of an idea of the sort of history that can be found within it. But believe me folks, that is just the tip of the iceberg, because as I said, there's 14,500 people buried there, and every one of them has a life story. And then of course we have the beginnings. It brings us back to what's now today's Clifton House, which of course was the old Belfast Poor House, with its history to do. And then we're going to do more histories on the darker side of Belfast. We're going to do Victorian murders, we're going to do the Belfast executions. There's lots more to do. So keep an eye out on our channel, Conley Cove, and that's where you'll get to see a lot more of these videos being added on. So my name's Joe Baker, I'm from the Belfast History Project, and as I said, keep an eye on Conley Cove.